Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire is recognized.
First, all of us express our deepest concern to the senator from Florida, the people of Florida, the people of the Gulf Coast for what they're going through. It's really unconscionable, the situation down there, and I think the senator has correctly indicted the failure of the people responsible to bring the resources that are available on site in order to try to address this, at least the skimming of as much as of the oil as possible. So I appreciate him doing this on a daily basis until we can get something done. It's critical, obviously. I wanted to speak today, however, about an issue that's equally threatening, although not as obvious in many ways, to our nation. And that is our debt and the continued spending by this Congress in a way that ignores the fact that we are on the path to passing on to our children a nation which they will not be able to afford as a result of the massive debt which is being put on their backs. We heard today from a number of senators from the other side of the aisle how we have to pass this extender bill. There is some irony in this, in that they're claiming that it is necessary in order to address what are significant stresses on Americans who find themselves confronted with this economic slowdown. What they don't address, of course, is the fact that in passing this bill in the way that they've structured it, they're going to put even greater stress on the next generation of Americans by creating even more debt for them to pay off. There are some legitimate ideas and programs in this extender bill, but they should be paid for. They should all be paid for. They shouldn't simply be put on the credit card and pass to the next generation. These are issues which address costs of today. Unemployment insurance, the tax extenders. These are issues which affect today's spending, and they should be paid for with today's dollars. We shouldn't just borrow from the next generation in order to pay for this problem, the problems which these and the issues which that this bill tries to address. And yet that's the proposal that comes to us. 3 times now they've brought these extender programs forward. Once they were going to add $79 billion to the deficit, and it failed on a point of order brought by myself on the issue of budget fiscal responsibility. Then they brought forward a proposal to spend $50 billion that wasn't paid for. And again, it failed. And now we're going to get a third proposal today, and I suspect it will also be a deficit proposal where we add to the debt and pass the bill on to our kids for something we want to do today that's politically attractive. But this is just a small tip of the iceberg for what's been happening around here. Since we passed pay-go legislation, and we heard all these grandiose statements by the President and by the Democratic leadership of the Senate and the House that they were going to use pay-go to discipline spending around here so that we wouldn't be passing these bills on to our kids. Since we passed that bill, now almost 2 months ago, we have spent or put in the pipeline to spend $200 billion. $200 billion of new spending that violates the pay-go rules, that adds to the debt of this country. But that, again, is only a small tip of the iceberg. When we look at what is happening to the federal debt, this is the line. This is where federal debt is going as a percentage of gross national product. Historically, our federal debts have been about 35% of gross national product. But since the Obama administration came into office and this Democratic Congress took control of fiscal policy in this country, that debt has just gone right through the ceiling, and there's no stop to it. It's just going up and up and up to the point now where total debt as a percent of GDP has passed the tipping point. What's the tipping point? Well, that's what Greece found. That's what Iceland found. That's what, regrettably, maybe Spain may be finding, which is it's when you get so much debt on the books that people stop believing you can really pay it back in an effective and efficient way. That people think that the world that's supposed to pay us, to lend us this money, regrettably it's other countries now, Saudi Arabia, Chinese, the Russians, they start asking themselves, can they really pay that debt back? And if they, shouldn't I charge a lot more to lend them money because I'm not too sure they can pay that debt back? That tipping point is 60% of GDP. When your public debt ratio, when your debt to public to the gross national product exceeds 60% of GDP, it's generally accepted in the world community that you've passed the tipping point. And when it gets up to around 90% of GDP, well, you're in junk bond status. You're on your way to bankruptcy. You're going to become a Greece. We have an advantage over Greece. We can do something called monetize our debt, but we still have the same problem. And so we've passed 60% this year. Why do we do that? Because we're spending a lot of money we don't have. On the extender program and on the other $200 billion of spending that's come to this floor since we did pay-go, on the stimulus package, on the health care bill. The health care bill expanded the size of this government by $2.5 trillion. Trillion dollars. And all of that is an expense which grows the government at a rate we can't afford. Under the president's own budget, as he sent it up here, and where is the budget, by the way? You know, did I miss something? Isn't the Congress of the United States supposed to do a budget? Isn't that what we're supposed to do as a responsible stewards of our financial house and of the American taxpayers' dollars? Where is the budget? Under the desk here? Maybe it's down where that paper was that just fell. Nobody can find it. Why is that? Because the other side of the aisle doesn't want to show the American people what the deficits are, how much spending they're planning to do that they don't plan to pay for, not only in this year, but for the next 10 years. The president at least had the integrity, I guess under law he had to do it, to send up a budget. And his own budget projects a $1.4 trillion deficit this year. $1.4 trillion. That's 4 times larger. 3.5 times larger than the biggest budget under the Bush administration. Biggest budget deficit. It is the largest budget deficit in our history. $1.4 trillion. But that's not the end of it. For the next 10 years, the president's budget projects a $1 trillion deficit on average every year for the next 10 years. And the practical effect of the president's own budget is that the debt of this country doubles in 5 years and triples in 10 years. These are staggering numbers. These are numbers that lead to bankruptcy of our nation from a standpoint of fiscal policy. You don't have to look too far to see what these type of numbers mean. Just look at what's happening in Greece and other countries that have grossly overextended their debt. Doubling the deficit, the debt in 5 years, tripling it in 10 years. This is an unacceptable action. To try to put it, the numbers are so big it's very hard to put them in context, but to try to put them in some sort of context, if you take all the debt rung up by presidents since the beginning of our country, starting with George Washington through George W. Bush, that's $5.8 trillion. That's all the debt of all the presidents who came before President Obama in this Democratic Congress. Under the budget sent up by the president, the debt that will be added will be 3 times that, almost 3 times that. Amount run up over all these 200 plus years that we've been a nation, 232 years. In 10 years, we will be adding more debt than occurred in the first 232 years by a factor of almost 2.5, over 2.5. It's incredible. And yet, nobody around here says anything or does anything about it on the other side of the aisle. What we hear from the other side of the aisle is, let's bring out another bill. Let's game the entitlements. Let's game the pay-go rules one more time, as the extender bill does or tries to do. And let's spend some more money that we don't have and add it to the deficit and the debt. Bill after bill after bill after bill is brought to this floor to do that. Spend money we don't have and add it to the debt. Well, what's it mean in real terms? A child born at the beginning of the President Obama's administration and this Democratic Congress, this liberal Congress, shouldn't even be called Democratic Congress because it's so liberal, had an $85,000 debt on their back. $85,000. Think of that, when they were born. Well, however, as of today, they now have a $114,000 debt on their back. That means the kids born just 4 years ago, not even 4 years ago, 2.5 years ago, 1.5 years ago, have had added to their burden. And they're going to have to bear this burden. I mean, this is not theoretical. This debt is owed. It's owed to China. It's owed to Russia. It's owed to Saudi Arabia. This debt has to be paid back by these people, our children. And just in the last year and a half, it's gone up by almost $30,000. And by the end of this presidency, should the president be reelected, or toward even a little bit past that, by the end of the budget as projected by this president, that debt on these children will be $196,000. That's what they'll have to pay. How are they supposed to buy a home, buy a car, send their kids to college if they have to pay off this debt, which they'll have to do through the tax burden? It's inexcusable. Inexcusable what we're doing here. And then you have to couple it with the larger picture. Is anything being done to improve this situation? Well, here's the president's own numbers. Historically, taxes have been about 18% of GDP. So you'll hear a lot of people on the other side of the aisle say, we just need to raise taxes more. We need to raise taxes more. We need to raise taxes more. Well, under the president's own budget, they're projecting that taxes are going to go up rather dramatically to 20%, almost 20% of GDP. The only thing is, what they don't tell you is that spending has historically been about 20% of GDP. So if we had the tax revenues they're projecting, we actually wouldn't have hardly a deficit at all. We'd be in pretty good shape. But that's not what's happening. As a result of the president's programs, and note here how this line goes up sharply during the recession, comes back down, is estimated to come back down because of the stimulus being taken out of the spending stream. A very badly flawed decision, by the way, to pass the stimulus in the form it was passed. But then it goes straight back up, and if we were to extend this line, it would be way up here. And what's that caused by? That's caused by the health care bill. $2.5 trillion of new spending, and by the aging of the population. There is no attempt to take this line and bring it down where it should be going so that we close that figure. No, this area in here is a structural deficit that has been grossly, it's not structural, it's created deficit that has been grossly aggravated by the policies of this administration and is being aggravated every day by the policies of this Congress as they bring forward, as we've seen more and more bills brought forward which are unpaid for and end up adding to this red line going up. It is not a tax issue. It is not a revenue issue. The president's own budget, and these are the president's budget numbers, show that it's not a revenue issue. Revenues, they project, will be very robust and will be well above their historic highs fairly soon. Well, why would they do this? Why would people be doing this to our nation, running us into bankruptcy like this, putting this burden on the next generation that is so extraordinary? Well, I think there's a philosophy here. The philosophy is pretty simple. This administration is very committed to moving the American model. They want to take us down the road of a European-style social welfare state democracy, where you essentially have cradle-to-grave coverage of all sorts of social concerns, and you have an ever-expanding, dramatically expanding public sector. The president's very honest about this. He said, the way you create prosperity is to grow the government. Boy, I don't think anybody ever believed he'd grow it quite this much, but he was honest about it at least. But the implications of it are, because of the fact that we don't have the capacity to pay for this government, that we're driving ourselves right into a ditch as a nation. We're putting ourselves into a totally unstable situation, which will inevitably lead to some sort of fiscal crisis which will be cataclysmic for our country and will lead to a lower standard of living. I mean, that's what this inevitably leads to, a lower standard of living, not a higher standard of living for the next generation. The European model is not a good model for us to pursue. It simply isn't. Look at what's happening in Europe. Anemic growth, lack of creativity in the area of economic growth, very little productivity, and basically countries wallowing in a debt structure which they can't get out from under because they're not willing to make the tough decisions. Are we going to pick that path also? It appears that way. Under this administration and this Congress, that appears to be the choice. But it's the wrong choice. There are ways to address this. To begin with, we can stop spending. You know, very simple. Stop spending money we don't have. Stop bringing bills to the floor that have high deficits attached to them. We need to address the entitlement programs and recognize that they are, in their present structure, not affordable. We need to address our tax laws, which are not structured in order to create an incentive for productivity and capital formation, but are instead replete with special benefits to special interest groups. We can reduce the rates on all Americans, and especially we can reduce the rate on the productive side of the ledger, on our corporate rates, which is now the second highest in the world, and still generate significantly more revenues if we do a total tax reform along the lines of what Senator Wyden and I have actually proposed. And we need to change our energy policy. We have to stop shipping all this money overseas and buying energy. We need American production of energy. We need more nuclear, we need more gas, natural gas. We obviously need more conservation. We need better cars, hybrids, electrics. And sure, we need renewables, but the renewables are not going to solve the problem. It is in production of American energy that we need to solve the problem, primarily, and in conservation. And most importantly, we need to abandon this idea that we should follow the European model because it stifles productivity, entrepreneurship, risk-taking. We need a model that says to the American people, be creative. That has been at the essence of what has made us strong as a nation. It has always been one of our unique advantages over the rest of the world. We have always been filled with Americans willing to take a risk, willing to make an investment, willing to go out and push the envelope. And as a result, they've created jobs in the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. But that's all at risk now because we decided to depart on this path of massive deficit and debt in order to recreate a European form of government, a social welfare state, which is, first, not sustainable, and secondly, is not a model for prosperity. So it's time to change, and let's begin to change right here, right now, by rejecting any extender bill that comes to this floor that is not fully paid for. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.